I work on the coast of Essex. It's a landscape that I've lived with all my life. I've grown up here, and I think it's a place that I don't necessarily think of as different from myself now. Maybe there's a sort of very permeable barrier between myself and the landscape. So I've used the landscape to make paintings with for, well, as long as I've been making paintings. The landscape it's very soft, it's very fluid, it's a landscape that dissolves. It's not like the landscape of the west coast of Britain, where you get a very hard and dynamic meeting of land and sea. When you get to the east coast, it feels as if the landscape's running out, as if it's slowly melting and dissolving into the sea. When you map something, when you draw a line round land, it implies that there's a static state to the land. The east coast shows you how wrong you are, because it's constantly in flux. It's moving, it's dissolving, shapes are changing. So that line, which maybe you think defines the landscape, is very impermanent. I think painting makes it more important than just being about a specific landscape, because if it remains about that specific landscape, I mean, how much reach and resonance has that got? I think the fact that they are paintings gives it a resonance beyond a specific starting point. When I go out walking, it's along the seawalls, so there's a very thin thread that goes out onto the marshes, out into the landscape, and the seawall is what really stops the sea flooding into the low-lying farmland. Often at high tide, the salt water outside the seawall is higher than the water in the dikes inside the seawall. Outside the seawall, there's marshes, there's saltings, mud flats, but because as the sea level rises, there's nowhere for that landscape to migrate to, because it comes up against the hard barrier of the sea wall. To alleviate this, there's been several places where the seawall has been breached to allow the sea through, to create new salt marshes, new mud flats. There's a limited life to the seawall. The east coast is still sinking after the last ice age, so as the land is slowly sinking, the sea level is rising, the sea walls which protect the east coast have got a limited life. We usually think of landscape processes as running over geological time, but here you can see them running on a human timescale. Things that I knew when I was a child have gone, are out under the sea. We used to walk on the cliff tops at the Naze, at Walton on the Naze, and there was a half telegraph pole there with pegs, steps either side, which we used to climb up. That, a long time ago, that disappeared out into the sea. The concrete block which anchored it into place is now lying out on the beach. If I'm out on the sea wall watching the tide coming in or going out, you get a very real sense of this being almost two landscapes layered on top of each other. There's the high tide and the low tide landscape, and I see this as quite a painterly process, in that as the tide comes in, it's covering up what was previously there, and as it goes out, it's remaking what was there. So I think I've learnt from that a way of layering up the paint, of changing things, of allowing paint to almost act as an incoming tide to conceal and then reveal new things. A painting might have a very simple premise in that some of the paintings I'm working on at the moment are about the interaction between the shape of a creek and the shape of the saltings, about positive and negative shapes, about light shapes and dark shapes. So it's a very simple premise, but during the process of that painting developing over weeks and months, all sorts of other things are allowed in. It might initially start with the weather, the time of day, the kind of temperature. It might be about things I've heard, whether they're birds and geese calling out in the landscape, or whether it's something I've talked to someone else with. It might be something on the radio. And then there's things I read, the music you listen to, your thoughts and doubts and prayers and all sorts of things get embedded into the painting in some way. But I think that is only the context in which the painting is made. It's not necessarily about any of those things. I'm not convinced that painting is about anything, or at least if it is about something, they're secondary meanings. And I think that is one of the glories of painting, that it's purposeless and useless in a way. Its meaning is in it being a painting. It's not in the painting, it is the painting. Making art important by bestowing important secondary meanings on it really avoids us assessing and judging the work as art.